While entire armies froze on the American plains, the Apaches disappeared into the mountains in winter and reappeared in spring, stronger, faster, and more lethal. The survival secrets that made this possible took decades for scholars to understand, and many still surprise experts today. In this video, you'll discover the ancestral secrets of extreme survival that allowed the Apaches to withstand conditions that killed well-equipped men within hours. And it all started long before the first snowfall came down the slopes of the White Mountains. The first thing we need to understand is that the history of the Apaches, like most indigenous American peoples, was told for a long time through the wrong lens. In Hollywood movies, the typical Apache appears as a half-naked warrior, galloping through the desert in the middle of summer, a wild and unpredictable figure who appears out of nowhere and vanishes into thin air. The cold, the winter, the snow. These dimensions practically don't exist in the narrative that cinema sold us for decades, but the historical reality is radically different, and it begins in a place few associate with the Apaches, the frozen heights of the Rocky Mountains, where temperatures could, in extreme cases recorded by American military expeditions in the 19th century, plunge to levels that would make any reasonable European explorer pack up camp and retreat. The title of this video mentions 71 degrees, and we need to be upfront about this from the start. That number doesn't represent a common temperature in Apache territories. It reflects the absolute extremes recorded in the high-altitude regions of the American West, including peaks of the White Mountains in Arizona and the slopes of New Mexico, where the mountain group Apaches, known as the White Mountain Apache, maintained seasonal camps. But even far less extreme temperatures, the 20-degree, 30-degree that were absolutely common in those winters, were enough to kill any unprepared human being within a few hours. And that's exactly where Apache culture reveals its first and most fundamental secret. They never tried to survive the winter. They prepared for it months in advance, as if snow were a certainty as immutable as the rising sun. Historian Grenville Goodwin, who spent years among the Western Apache in the first half of the 20th century and documented their customs in the book The Social Organization of the Western Apache, published in 1942, recorded something that shocked many of his contemporaries. The Apaches possessed a survival calendar as precise and sophisticated as any European agricultural system of the time. Each season had a name. Each name carried instructions. Winter was not a threat. It was a season with its own rules, and those who knew the rules survived. The first secret was in the mountains, but not the way you'd imagine. When American soldiers tried to pursue Apache warriors in winter, they encountered a frustrating and often deadly situation. The tracks simply vanished at higher elevations. American Army officers, recording these pursuits in the military archives of Fort Bowie and Fort Apache between the 1860s and 1880s, repeatedly described the same thing. The Apache seemed to dissolve into the snow. What they didn't understand was that the warriors weren't fleeing into the mountains. They were going home. The Apaches, particularly the groups inhabiting the elevated regions of the Arizona Territory and New Mexico, didn't fear altitude. They mastered it. This begins with something seemingly simple but deeply sophisticated: absolute topographical knowledge of the territory. Every valley, every ravine, every rocky outcropping that blocked the north wind, every south-facing slope that received more hours of sunlight in winter, all of it was mapped in the collective memory of the Apache tribe with a precision that took generations to accumulate. Cochise, the great leader of the Chiricahua Apache, was famous among American military officers for his seemingly supernatural ability to vanish with hundreds of warriors, women, and children in open terrain. General George Crook, who later developed a deep respect for the Apaches, wrote in his reports that pursuing Cochise in the Dragoon Mountains during winter was the equivalent of chasing ghosts. You saw the marks of where they had been, never where they were. The secret wasn't magic. It was topography. The Chiricahua knew every one of the hundreds of caves and crevices in the Dragoon Mountains, every passage that became invisible under snow cover, every escape route that a mounted soldier could never negotiate. But knowledge of the terrain was only the beginning. The true heart of Apache survival in extreme cold lay in the structure they called the wickiup, and this is where historical reality begins to shatter a few more persistent myths. In American movies, when a Native American in winter is shown, you typically see a conical leather tent. the teepee, associated with the Great Plains nations like the Lakota and the Cheyenne. The Apaches didn't use teepees. The traditional Apache structure, the wickiup, was a completely different engineering design, developed specifically for the conditions of the American Southwest and the mountains the Apaches inhabited. It was low, semi-spherical, built with a frame of curved willow or scrub oak branches, covered by layers of reed, dry grasses and, when available, deer or elk hide. The low, rounded shape wasn't aesthetic, it was aerodynamic. In a mountain valley, where the wind can create devastating gusts, a low, curved structure offered far less resistance than a vertical construction. The wickiup practically hugged the ground, and its entrance, always positioned facing east, turned its back on the dominant winds from the north and west. Historian and ethnographer Maurice Opler, in his monumental work, An Apache Lifeway, published in 1941 and still considered one of the definitive references on Apache culture, described in detail the construction of a winter wickiup among the Chiricahua. The process took between 4 and 6 hours for an experienced family, but the result was a structure that maintained interior temperatures significantly higher than the outside, even without a constant fire. It's estimated that a well-built wickiup could maintain a temperature difference of over 20 degrees Celsius between the interior and the outside environment, thanks to the combination of multi-layer insulation and extremely low heat loss through convection. The floor was covered with thick layers of grasses and animal hides, which acted as thermal insulation between the human body and the frozen ground, because dying from contact with the cold ground was, according to historical records, just as real a risk as dying exposed to the wind. Imagine the interior of an Apache wickiup on a winter night in the White Mountains, the smell of smoke embedded in leather and grasses, the dense, humid heat, almost suffocating after the biting cold outside, the sound of the wind trying to penetrate the reed walls and failing, a small fire in the center, not large, never too large, with smoke rising in a slow spiral through the ventilation hole at the top, children wrapped in bear hides, the entire family sleeping close together, because human warmth was itself a resource managed with awareness. The fire inside the wickiup deserves special attention because it reveals another layer of Apache survival intelligence. Contrary to what many imagine, the Apaches didn't build large fires. Large fires consume more fuel, create more smoke, and, crucially, reveal the camp's location from a distance. In a culture that spent decades at war against the American army and rival groups, discretion was as much a part of the survival strategy as warmth. The Apaches developed what we might call the art of efficient minimal fire. Specific woods that produce more heat with less flame, stacking techniques that maximized combustion, and careful management of the ember cycle that maintained heat for longer without requiring constant feeding. Eve Ball, a journalist and historian who spent decades collecting oral accounts from Apache survivors in New Mexico, documented in her book Inde, An Apache Odyssey, published in 1980, several accounts in which elders described the precise choice of wood for the winter fire as a skill taught from childhood, as important as knowing how to ride or use a bow. But here we reach a point that most people never consider. What about when fire wasn't an option? There were situations, military pursuits, storms that made lighting a fire impossible, urgent nighttime movements, in which the Apaches needed to generate and conserve body heat without any fire source. And it was precisely in those moments that the deep knowledge about the human body that Apache culture had developed over generations became a matter of life or death. Researchers who studied the accounts of Apache survivors and the records of Bureau of Indian Affairs agents from the late 19th century were repeatedly struck by the empirical physiological knowledge that the Apaches demonstrated about how body heat works, knowledge that conceptually anticipated discoveries that Western medicine would only formalize decades later. The Apaches understood in a practical sense that human heat is primarily lost through 3 pathways: the head, the hands, and the feet. Any Apache warrior in a situation of extreme cold covered those 3 parts of the body before any other. Does that seem obvious today? In the 19th century, American soldiers were dying of hypothermia, wearing inadequate boots and without head coverage, while Apache warriors who evaded them wore double-layered leather moccasins with inner hide lining, wool and leather wrappings for the legs and hide hoods for the head. Apache winter clothing was the result of centuries of refinement. The moccasins of cold region Apaches were dramatically different from summer moccasins, taller, with a shaft rising to the knee, with a double sole of rawhide, and in some documented cases, stuffed with dry grasses between the layers, functioning as thermal insulation. Today, this principle is identical to what modern winter boot manufacturers call air gap insulation, a trapped layer of air that prevents heat from conducting outward. The Apaches arrived at this solution not through theory, but through millennia of trial, error, and observation, passed down from generation to generation as sacred survival knowledge. Victorio, the military leader of the Warm Springs Apache, considered by many military historians as one of the most brilliant guerrilla strategists in American history, conducted entire campaigns in winter precisely because he knew that was when his advantage over the American army was most pronounced. While regular troops suffered from the cold, mules unfit for deep snow and supplies that froze solid, Victorio's warriors moved with a speed that left American officers baffled. General John Pope wrote to the War Department in 1879 that the ability of Victorio's followers to operate in winter, at altitudes where American war horses simply couldn't function, was perhaps the greatest tactical challenge the army had faced since the Civil War. What Pope didn't describe in his reports, but which later researchers documented in depth, was the role of nutrition in that equation. Surviving extreme cold is not just a matter of clothing and shelter, it is fundamentally a matter of internal fuel. The human body in the cold works constantly to maintain its core temperature, and that work burns calories at an accelerated rate. A human being exposed to temperatures of 20 degrees Celsius without physical activity may need significantly more energy daily than in mild temperatures, according to estimates by modern physiologists. With intense physical activity, like what Apache warriors perform during winter movements, that energy demand rises even further. The Apaches not only knew this principle empirically, they had developed a winter food system precisely calibrated to address it. The Apache winter diet was deliberately richer in fat than the summer diet. This was not an accident. It was sophisticated nutritional strategy. Fat provides more than twice the energy per gram than carbohydrates, and in extreme cold, the body processes it more efficiently for heat generation. Apache pemmican, a version of the survival ration that existed in different forms among dozens of indigenous nations on the continent, combined dried ground meat, usually deer or elk, with animal fat and nuts, such as walnuts or processed mescal. A small block of Apache pemmican could sustain a warrior on the move for an entire day in conditions of extreme cold. Anthropologist Keith Basso, who conducted extensive research among the western Apache in Arizona and published his seminal work, Wisdom Sits in Places, in 1996, recorded accounts from Apache elders who described the preparation of winter food reserves as a community ritual as important as any religious ceremony. Meat was dried in the autumn sun before the first frosts, then smoked with specific woods that inhibited bacterial growth. Piñon nuts, gathered at the heights during late summer, were roasted and stored in tightly woven baskets. Agave, the mescal, was cooked in earthen ovens for days at a time and then pressed into dense blocks that lasted months without spoiling. Each item in that winter pantry was the product of deep knowledge about food preservation that required no salt, sugar, or refrigeration, resources the Apaches simply didn't have available. The smell of mescal cooking in an earthen oven for 3 days, a sweet and earthy smoke that soaked into the clothes and hair of everyone in the camp, was for an Apache child the smell of winter arriving. Not of danger, but of preparation, of collective care, of wisdom in action. But there was one dimension of Apache survival in extreme cold that historians took longer to recognize in its full sophistication: the role of Apache women as guardians of survival knowledge. In the narrative of American cinema, and even in part of traditional historiography, Apache history is often told as a story of male warriors: Cochise, Geronimo, Victorio, Mangas Coloradas. But the accounts documented by the Apaches themselves, collected by historians like Eve Ball and anthropologist B. Medicine, reveal a different truth. It was Apache women, those who rarely appeared in military reports, who held and transmitted most of the practical survival knowledge that kept the bands alive in winter. It was an Apache woman who knew exactly in which microclimate of which valley to build the wickiup for maximum wind protection. She was the one who knew which medicinal plants to harvest before snow covered the ground, which ones treated the painful cracks in skin caused by the dry cold at high altitudes, which could be used to make a tea that, according to accounts collected by Goodwin, functioned as a circulatory stimulant for people with mild hypothermia. She was the one who coordinated the food reserves, who knew how much had been stored and how much was needed for each member of the band through to spring. Lozan, the warrior and healer of the Warm Springs Apache, sister of Victorio, is a particularly well-documented case that breaks with all simplistic narratives about Apache gender roles. Lozan was a combat warrior, that is recorded in Victorio's own accounts, and in the memoirs of Kaitenai, one of the Apache leaders of the following generation, collected by Eve Ball. But she was equally respected as a healer and as an extreme survival specialist. When Victorio died in battle in Mexico in 1880, it was Lozan who guided the survivors back to American territory on a winter journey through the Chihuahuan Desert, a feat that American soldiers considered impossible when they learned of the conditions under which it was carried out. American military records from Fort Stanton and Fort Bliss in the 1880s, available in the National Archives in Washington, repeatedly describe the difficulty of tracking Apache groups in winter as being of a completely different order than the difficulty in summer. In summer, there were tracks, dust, smoke, the need for water that created predictable crossing points. In winter, the Apaches seemed to simply vanish. What American officers didn't understand was that this ability to disappear wasn't magic or luck. It was the product of extreme survival training that began in childhood. Apache children were exposed to cold progressively and deliberately from their earliest years. Reports from Bureau of Indian Affairs agents and accounts from 19th century missionaries describe with a mixture of shock and admiration the practice of cold water baths for Apache children even during winter, pre-dawn runs in below-freezing temperatures, physical exercises in conditions that American adults unaccustomed to such training would consider impractical. This was not cruelty, it was systematic preparation. The human body has a remarkable capacity to adapt to cold when exposed to it progressively. Peripheral vasoconstriction improves, metabolic heat generation increases, tolerance to discomfort grows. The Apaches knew this empirically millennia before cold physiology became an academic field of study. The chattering of teeth that gradually disappeared, the skin that stopped burning after weeks of regular exposure, the muscles that learned to work efficiently in the cold. An Apache child who went through this conditioning process became, over time, physiologically different from a child who grew up sheltered from the cold in heated environments, not in a supernatural way, but through the real adaptation mechanisms the human body possesses, and that are rarely tapped in civilizations that depend on artificial heating. And after the body came the mind. Apache warfare. And here we need to be precise. The Apaches were not involved in a war of choice, but in a survival war forced upon them by the American colonial advance into their ancestral territories, produced a generation of military strategists who used winter as a weapon, as consciously as they used rifles and bows. Geronimo, whose decades-long resistance to the American army and whose final capture in 1886 required an expedition involving more than 5,000 American soldiers and hundreds of Mexican scouts to capture a group of approximately 36 people, conducted several of his most audacious operations during winter. General Nelson Miles, in charge of the final campaign against Geronimo, wrote in his memoirs that the most unsettling aspect of pursuing the Chiricahua in winter was not the violence of the confrontations. It was their ability to simply exist in conditions where their pursuers could barely survive. American troops suffered from frostbite, from pneumonia, from horses that fractured legs on frozen ground, from supplies that couldn't get through snow-covered passes. Geronimo's followers moved through the same terrain in the same temperature, without those problems, or more precisely, with the ability to manage those problems that centuries of accumulated knowledge provided. Picture the biting wind in the Dragoon Mountains on a December night, with temperatures below 15 degrees below zero. The sound of American mule hooves stumbling on ice as ill-prepared soldiers tried to hold formation. And somewhere in the rocky crevices above, invisible, silent, warmed by perfectly positioned wickiups and well-nourished by carefully prepared pemmican reserves, Apache warriors, watching and waiting. Not victims of the winter, inhabitants of it. There was, however, one final dimension of Apache survival in extreme cold that remains the least documented and perhaps the most profound: the spiritual and psychological dimension. Modern ethnopsychiatry recognizes something that indigenous traditions around the world have always known. The ability to survive extreme conditions is not purely physical, it is mental. Hypothermia kills not only because the body loses heat, it kills because the mind begins to shut down before the body does. Panic, disorientation, the feeling of helplessness are just as lethal as the temperature. A human being who experiences psychological collapse in the face of cold loses the ability to make the correct decisions that could save them. The Apaches developed, over generations, a set of practices that today we might describe as mental resilience training. The Apache Sundance ceremony, the initiation rituals of young warriors, the long storytelling traditions in which the protagonist faces and overcomes impossible conditions. All of this had a practical function beyond the spiritual, to build in the mind of every tribal member the conviction that cold was an adversary that could be faced, not a force of inevitable destruction in the face of which there was only despair. Historian Dan L. Thrapp, in his monumental biography of Victorio published in 1974, cites an account from an Apache survivor who described how the elders of the group taught children to regard cold as a teacher, not an enemy. The logic was simple, but powerful. An enemy wants to destroy you. A teacher wants to make you grow. Treating cold as an enemy created fear. Treating it as a teacher created attention, respect, and skill. That psychological distinction, seemingly small, could be the difference between a child who panicked at the first snowstorm and a warrior who navigated through it with calculated confidence. Apache survival knowledge in extreme cold was not a collection of tricks or isolated techniques. It was an integrated system. Topography, architecture, clothing, nutrition, physical conditioning, mental training, community organization, and spiritual philosophy, functioning as a single coherent organism, refined over centuries of real life in the most demanding conditions the North American continent could offer. No part of that system worked on its own. It was the combination of all of them that made possible what American Army officers repeatedly described as impossible: to exist, fight, and prevail in the winter of the mountains of the American Southwest. Today, when extreme survival techniques have become an entire genre of digital content, when high-tech expedition gear is designed by engineers in controlled laboratories, it's worth remembering that a people who lived in twig and hide shelters developed solutions to extreme cold that anticipated by centuries the principles those engineers use: insulation through trapped air layers, heat management through the extremities, the importance of cold-specific caloric nutrition, progressive, physiological adaptation to the environment. The difference is that the Apaches had no laboratory. They had the real world with real consequences and the accumulated knowledge of every previous generation as their only instruction manual. Apache culture survived and continues to survive. The Apache nations exist today in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, and that simple fact carries a historical weight that deserves to be recognized in its full measure. Because what the Apaches faced was not only the cold of the mountains, it was something far more devastating: the systematic, deliberate, and violent attempt to erase their existence as a people. The American Army did not pursue the Apaches merely to capture them. It pursued them to break their will to exist. And winter was, in that equation, the most powerful ally any American general could have had, in theory. In practice, winter refused to work for the side they expected. The ancestral knowledge that allowed the Apaches to disappear into the mountains in winter, to survive in conditions that killed well-equipped soldiers, to conduct military campaigns in terrain where American horses fractured their legs on ice. That knowledge was not merely technical. It was the most concrete possible expression of an entire philosophy of life. The Apaches did not see the natural environment as something separate from themselves, something to be conquered or controlled. They saw themselves as part of the environment. Cold was not an external threat to be repelled with technology. It was a condition to be understood, respected, and inhabited. That philosophical distinction has practical consequences that go far beyond the 19th century. Today, when we talk about extreme survival, our first instinct is to think about gear. about technical fabrics, magnesium fire starters, expedition tents engineered in labs to withstand 80-kilometer-per-hour winds. There's nothing wrong with that arsenal, but the Apaches remind us of something that no piece of equipment can ever replace: the deep knowledge of the place where you are, accumulated over generations, passed down not in manuals, but in stories, in rituals, in everyday practices that shape the body and the mind before the crisis arrives. Grenville Goodwin, Maurice Opler, Eve Ball, Keith Basso, all the researchers who devoted their careers to documenting Apache culture arrived by different paths at the same conclusion. What made the Apaches extraordinary in the natural world was not a supernatural ability nor an insensitivity to cold and pain that would make them less human. It was exactly the opposite. It was a humanity more completely integrated into the natural world than most modern civilizations can even imagine. They felt the cold. They suffered from it. They lost people to it. But embedded in every layer of their culture, they had the tools to face it and to pass those tools on to the next generations with a fidelity that no book could surpass. Picture an Apache elder on a winter night inside a wickiup in the White Mountains, telling a child the story of how his grandfather had crossed the snow-covered mountain pass during the Great Pursuit, how he had built shelter with bare hands when the storm suddenly closed in, how he had remembered the orientation of the valley that his own grandfather had shown him decades before. That moment, an elder, a child, a story, the minimal fire at the center, was the most efficient mechanism for transmitting survival knowledge that Apache culture possessed. More efficient than any formal training, more lasting than any written record. Because the child was not just memorizing information, they were being shaped by it. They were learning not only what to do in the cold, but who to be in the face of it. It's impossible to study the Apaches and their extreme survival without feeling at the same time the profound weight of the injustice of what was done to them. A people who had developed one of the most sophisticated systems of survival in hostile environments that human history has ever known were hunted, displaced, confined to reservations, and their children were torn from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their own language, in an explicit policy, as Captain Richard Pratt declared in 1892, of killing the Indian to save the man. The knowledge that took centuries to build and that kept generations alive in impossible conditions was deliberately attacked as part of a project of cultural erasure. And yet, it survived. Not completely, not without irreplaceable losses, but it survived. The White Mountain Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Lipan communities exist today. Their members are doctors, lawyers, artists, teachers, athletes, and some of them still know the names of the valleys where their grandparents built wickiups in winter, still remember the stories that elders told about how to move through snow without leaving tracks, still carry in some layer of collective memory the fragments of the knowledge that baffled generals and survived one of the most systematic cultural erasure projects of modern history. That, more than any specific survival technique, is the true Apache legacy. Not the wickiup, not the double-layered moccasin, not the mescal and dried meat pemmican, though all of these stand as testaments to an extraordinary practical intelligence. The legacy is the refusal to disappear, the ability to survive not only the cold of the mountains, but the far deeper cold of a history that tried, repeatedly, to erase them. The Apaches survived winters that killed armies. They survived something far worse too, and they are here to tell it. If this video changed the way you look at extreme wilderness survival, indigenous American peoples, and the real complexity behind Apache history that cinema has never been able to show, hit like and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we'll dive into the secrets of the Lakota, how the warriors of the Great Plains survived the deadly northern blizzards, where cold killed in a completely different way and demanded solutions no Apache would recognize as their own. Two nations, two kinds of winter, two radically different philosophies of survival. Don't miss it. And before you go, of the Apache survival techniques you learned about today, the wickiup strategically positioned against the wind, the progressive physical conditioning to cold from childhood, the deliberately fat-rich winter diet, or the philosophy of treating cold as a teacher rather than an enemy, which do you think would have the greatest real-world impact on your own ability to survive an extreme cold situation?